Hey guys, Artfinity here, and I'm back with another drawing video, and this one will actually be a thorough tutorial on how layers work. It's a video I've been meaning to make for a long time. And before any of you start freaking out and being like, whoa man, what the heck with this and with all of these layers, what does that mean, huh? Don't worry, this is actually, we have a plan for today. The first thing I'm going to do is explain what layers are, how they work, how you can use them, and then we'll get to how I use them here. So I'm going to show you a little bit of principles, applications, and then I'll show you where I actually use them in this drawing itself. So this is just a point of reference, just keeping this in mind, because everything I show you, although it's going to be really simple steps, is what I use to make this final, like, real world image. So the first thing we're going to do is start off with layers. What the heck are they? This will be what you will mostly start off with if you're using a drawing program of any kind. It'll just be your first layer, and in Photoshop's case, it'll be locked. Tap there to unlock. So layers are really great because pretty much they can help you add depth to your drawing. They're something that can help you have a lot of extra control with it as well. But the downside is that they can get a little messy, like so, and a little hard to organize and keep track of. Fortunately, there are a couple of options that can help us out here. Whenever you create a new layer, which you can do by going over here to this little paper thing, by the way, you can also delete it by pressing the little trash can next to it. When you create a new layer, it automatically names it in a sequence. This is layer 1. If you create a bunch of them, this will be layer 7. And if you're at layer 300, it's kind of a pain to keep track of them. So I'm going to go ahead and show you a couple of organization methods before we get started with what they are, just to help you better keep track of them for your own stuff. So the good news about these layers is that you can name them. You can just tap them and then you can name them. I'm going to name this one what? Yep, if you want to have any practical use for them, you could call them line art, maybe shading. You can name them whatever you want to help you recognize them, but even in this list of stuff, it might still get a little hard to see them, and the good news is you can also color code them. If you right click, it'll give you an options window, and then you can just go to here to these color options, go ahead, pick yourself a color. That'll help you keep track of everything, because if you're anything like me, color coding is life, because you suck at organization. And amongst everything else, you can also create folders. So you just select a bunch of layers. You can do this by clicking on one, holding shift, and then clicking wherever else you want, or holding control and then clicking on specific layers. But if I wanted to select everything here, for example, there's a little folder icon that you can press and it'll make a little folder for you. You can also name these folders. I'm going to name these layers within layers, because that's pretty much what this is. And it has a little drop down where you can still see all of your layers. They're slightly indented, like there's a little tab next to them so you'll know what's inside of what, and that'll also help with organization. Good news is you can color code these too. So now that we know how to organize our layers and color code them, which in theory should be the easiest part, let's get into how the heck they work. What are they? I have an image here. It's kind of a crude drawing. I kind of slapped it together in like 5 seconds to show you what layers are. But this is the most important thing you can understand about layers, and that's how they work. You're going to see over here on the right, I have a bunch of different named layers. So you'll see tree, ground, clouds, and sky. The important thing to know about layers is the way that they are organized. It goes from the bottom and works towards the top. So I actually made this picture to very simply illustrate what I mean by that. The sky is the farthest thing backwards, therefore it is at the bottom. The tree is the thing that's the furthest forward, therefore it is at the top. And if I were to rearrange these layers in any way, it changes the order of the image. Because the ground is in front of the tree, it shows up first and it cuts it off. If the sky were in front of everything else, you only see the sky. So this is just to show you that organization is important here, and just remember, bottom is farther away. Top is at the very front. Layers are like individual drawings. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new one, and I'm going to name this one Sun. And we're going to go ahead and add ourselves a little sun just to show you what I mean. So I'm going to go up here, and in the corner, I'm going to draw a nice little sun. But you see that I can move it around. I can do anything I can with this. This is treated as its own individual image because it's on its own individual layer. So that means that if I wanted to make the tree bigger, for example, and I use the transform tool, I'm only moving the tree. Whereas if this was all one image and I try to resize the tree, it doesn't go so great for me. Even if I use a selection tool like this and try to move the tree, you'll see that it still takes a part of the grass with it because it's not its own separate image. So each one of these works as its own separate layer. The tree is its own drawing, the ground is its own drawing, the clouds, the sky, the sun, all of it is its own drawing. Just in regards to that, like I said, the order is important, so just make sure that whenever you're working on an image, your layers are in the right place. A real-world example of how this could break in this drawing, for example, is the umbrella. The umbrella is one of the things that's in the farthest back, and I don't want it in front of Neo. This is Neo from Ruby, by the way. So if the umbrella were actually higher in the order, it would show up before she does. So in layering, the most important thing to do is just to recognize that they're stacked correctly. So that could be how it would realistically break an image. But anyway, now that we know about layers and what they are here, it's time to get fancy. So here, you're going to see there's a lot going on, but don't worry about it. I'm pretty much going to show you everything one at a time. So here we have spheres, and with them, because we like our primary colors, I just made them muted because we're actually going to be shading all of them. So we have this separated into 3 different things. One layer, this is pretty much good for convincing people that you're a robot. We're going to go ahead and color on this, and I'm going to show you the advantages and disadvantages of using that. Clipped layers, which I'll go ahead and explain in a minute, which is good for cell shading, and then locked opacity, which is good for controlled shading. So we'll just be working with 3 different coloring options, which will probably be the reason why most people want to use layers, and we'll just go ahead and get into it now. So you'll see in my little layers option, I went ahead and I organized everything. Look at me being good at naming things. So here I have the text, I have the line art. I abbreviate that by typing la because some people can't be bothered to type in 6 letters. And then blue, yellow, and red, just to let you know what we're working with. And then just the white of the background. And remember what I said about layering being important. If I want to change that background color, I can. But we're not going to. Let's go ahead and start with red. 1 layer. So I'm going to name this one red, and then just to have a little abbreviation with it, I'm going to name it 1 layer. That means if I try to do everything here and try to add the shading, all good. I'm just getting rid of the shading so you can see what I mean. So that means that I'm trying to add in the shading, but you notice it kind of overshoots the line. And it can. Or if I erase, it erases everything. Just because this is all on 1 layer, it's considered 1 drawing, so whatever happens on this is just what's going to be happening in general. So the advantage of this is for convincing people that you're a robot, or those 1 layer challenges if you're cool enough to do that. But there is actually a legitimate advantage to this because your whole image is in front of you and it's very cohesive. You can like add, transform, and edit things. This is the working style that'll definitely make you not lost. So you don't need to worry about layers because you only have 1 to work with. But as you can see, it's quite messy and quite hard to work with. Every line you make is relatively permanent. I mean, there's still Control-Z, but I mean, you see that I'm trying to add shading and refine it, but it's actually cutting out of the base that I had to begin with. So it's really good for organization, but it's not so good for keeping the main base. Now onto clipped layers. Good for cell shading. We're going to be using the yellow this time. There is an option in most drawing programs that whenever you are working with a layer, let's say you only want to color inside of the yellow. How do you do that? Other than being really good and just never coloring outside the lines, there's an easier way. If you actually create another new layer, and just for the sake of organization, I'm going to call this one shading, you can do something called clipping a layer. The shortcut in Photoshop is Ctrl-Alt-G, and you'll see it creates a little arrow. So now you're seeing this layer, which is called shading, has a little arrow attached to yellow. Now, what does that arrow do? What does that mean? It means that it's clipped. And instead of explaining what that means, it's easier to just show you what that means. Remember how over here we had trouble coloring inside the lines? Not so much here. Pretty much what this does is it sets a boundary. It's kind of like masking tape to tell you, no, you can only color inside of the base for the beginning layer. The one that's at the bottom before all these arrows is always going to be the foundation you work with. So if I'm back at yellow and I draw a second circle, you'll see where I still shot outside of the lines are actually going to show up now because I'm working with the base. But again, back to the shading layer, this is really good for actually coloring inside of the lines, and then you can create as many chains for this as you want. You can clip as many layers to a base as you want. Now this is really good for this kind of drawing because I've actually done it a lot myself. I pretty much with the umbrella, I clipped that, and if I do, then that means I can't color outside of it. So that means I don't need to worry about hitting the background. I don't need to worry about coloring Neo on accident. If I just clip the umbrella, I can only work on the umbrella and I'll never color outside of the lines. It's also really good for the hair if you want to make a base for just the hair and you shade the hair or the skin or anything like that. So this is actually something that I use relatively often. Actually, in all honesty, Neo herself is just one big clipped layer. So pretty much what I did with that is I just clipped everything together. Then I made different selections and then I was just like coloring that as is. But you'll see she stays separate from the background. She stays separate from the umbrella and everything else. And it's really good for organization. So now I'm going back here. And like I said, you can do this with multiple things. So I'm going to create another layer. I'm going to clip this one again, and this one is going to be highlights. And just with this, I'm just going to go ahead and add some in. So you'll see here, we have a layer for our highlights, we have a layer for our shading, and then we have the base. This is why it's so good for cell shading, because if you have hair, for example, you just need to color in all the lines for the hair with the base color once, create a clipping layer, add the shading, add as many as you want of layers for the shading, and then add in the highlights, and everything stays organized and it's still magically inside the lines, and it's great. And if you want to use more than one layer for this, then by all means, just call this shading 2. So you want to have like extremely dark highlights in it or something, and then you're like, no, that's a bit much. Let's just go ahead and get rid of it. You can do that. And you also toggle visibility with the little eye thing here. Now with the last thing, it's kind of like with clipped layers, but a little more straightforward. So this one is locked opacity, good for controlled shading. So again, we're going to the blue, and instead of creating a layer and then clipping it to this one, what we're going to go ahead and do is just only use the blue. So there's a little option here with this little transparent box, which is called lock opacity. And now you're going to see that this blue has a little lock by it. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't draw on it. That just means that this is locked, meaning if I try to erase it, but then color back in again, it still keeps all the information that's in there. Or if I try to shade, it's still inside the lines like before, but it's on a single layer. So locked opacity is kind of like a combination of a one layer thing and a clipped layers thing. You color inside the lines, but you can't change the base. So this is a good in between for both of them. Whereas you're still only using one layer, it's still not going to color outside of the lines. And this is really good for more controlled rendering, more controlled shading. You actually use that a lot here. So say I'm working on the face or something and I only want to be working on the face, I can lock the opacity, work on the face, and if I want to add something in later, I can create a new layer and then work on hair. So let's say, for example, I want to give her a hat. And so I'm just going to go to the very top because remember I said about organization. I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to name it hat. And let's just go ahead and like give her a funny little top hat. I'll add it on this side. It's a little weird for composition, but it's just so you can see it a little easier. So you're seeing I'm just adding in the base for the hat. I'm just making sure that that's all good, and I want to color it in now because it's not as rendered as she is. I have a couple of different options. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to lock the opacity. I'm going to work with this and add in some of the shading. But you'll see that it doesn't go outside of the lines, so it's still all inside of the limits that I set. Whereas if it wasn't locked, I could draw all over. So we're going to pretend that this hat looks nice, because this is just more like for application to explain this is how layers work. But yeah, locked opacity, it's really good for controlled shading. So just again, another brief overview before we get into like wrapping this up. So one layer is really good for convincing people you're a robot. It's very good for streamlined, straightforward working, but you got to be very good at committing to the lines that you're making, because it will affect the whole piece. Clip layers are really good for cell shading, just because you can add like layer upon layer upon layer of shading, and it's really good for like not going outside the lines. This is pretty much the magical like coloring inside the lines thing. And then locked opacity, good for controlled shading, which means that you won't go outside of the lines. You pretty much just need to draw in the general shape of what you want first, and then you're good to go. And if you want to include line art, just make sure that's above everything else. Back in this pecking order of things to do. If line art were to go here, most of the time it would be at the very top, just so you could actually see it in everything else. So I know that a lot of people that are watching this video probably do draw manga, so I'll just give you a pretty straightforward example of a very basic method for organizing your layers. So like anything, you'll probably need a layer for your sketch. Just ignore that, because this is entirely for demonstrational purposes. And then above that, you'll probably have the line art. And this also goes without saying, but you'll see next to every layer is an opacity option. If you're working with the sketch that you want to line art, you can lower the opacity. Or, like I was telling you about before, and this is a decent trick, about the locked opacity thing. Remember how I told you about that one? Good for controlled shading. Well, this is also good for your sketch. Say you want your sketch to be blue after you're done coloring it in. No problem. There you go. It's blue. Just make sure that the opacity is locked, because if it's not, you're gonna... and that ain't pretty. So as soon as your sketch is done, you can get that out of the way. So have your line art, you'll have your base coloring. So I have a smiley face here, for example, and then probably a more practical option that you guys will be working with, hair. So I'll have a layer that is clipped, and this is for shading. So you'll see here on the face there's just shading, on her hair there is shading, and make sure that it's clipped, otherwise it'll look like this. If it does look like that, Control-Alt-G. And with the highlights, those as well. So you'll see they're overshooting, so make sure that they are grouped, and you'll tell because it has the little arrows right there. Then bam, there you go. That is a more realistic example of something that you guys would probably do. So, like I said before, I used all three of these coloring options here. So there really is no right or wrong one. You can definitely pick and choose what you need, because some are just better for different scenarios. Over here with the one layer thing, that was actually very useful for drawing this hand, just because I more or less wanted to figure out where everything goes, and I was just kind of getting feel for where the hand goes. So this was all on one layer. And then over here with the clipped layers, which is good for cell shading, I actually used that for a part of the hair. And the belts, just so the belts didn't actually accidentally start coloring into the pants. So you'll see that with the belts, that's all clipped layers. And then with the last one for locked opacity, which is really good for controlled shading, I did that with the hat. And I also did that with the umbrella. So now, as promised, I'm just going to go through a general walkthrough of what I did with this drawing, just to give you a point of reference, like what I did, why I did it, and why that would be helpful. So before anything else, I had the sketch on top. So let me just go ahead and get rid of this. And even before I had the sketch on top, I still had the work in progress folder. So just let me go ahead and pull that up. This drawing all started with a gesture that I used the clipped opacity to turn into a blue sketch. So I started off with this gesture, which then I turned into the sketch. And then from that sketch, I left that at the very top so I would have a point of reference. I added in a background, some clouds, and then a little bit of shading for those clouds. And then I decided that, you know what, it looks nice, but I actually like it more black and white. Now that's actually with a color filter that I won't necessarily get into in this video, maybe another video. But as soon as I was done with that, I just went ahead and I added a little bit more definition. Then, like I said, back to front, like we did with this drawing, I added in the umbrella. Then from the umbrella, I added in the little, like, spike things. The little metal beams for the umbrella that I don't quite remember what they're called. Then Neo, take note that this was not all done on one layer, because there is another thing that you can do in this. Once you have all your shading and you have it all good, you can click on a layer and then hold shift and click on the bottom layer, then press Control E. That merges them. So all those layers that you had can become one layer. And it just makes it easier to work with in some cases, but not all cases. So I'd say use that, you know, at your leisure. All right, then from here, I just added a little bit of minute shading. It's very subtle, but you see, like, I just accentuated some shadows. Then more shadows, and probably highlights, but I can't remember where this one is. And yeah, just this is a little bit of the highlights on the hair. So it's just very subtle details. And that's how I put that drawing together. And as you can see right now, the sketch is still visible. So I'm just going to go over here to the work in progress, make that transparent, and then bam, there you go. Here is Neo with a ruined umbrella. So yeah, I kind of ran through that. I hope it made sense. I try to keep the explanation as simple as possible. Just because there really is a lot to do with layers. There's a lot of options. There's no right and wrong way to use them. It's just personal preference pretty much. And in regards to this actual Neo drawing, I will have a speed paint for this up soon, pretty much just as soon as I finish it. So if you watch this video and you have an understanding of how layers work, then as soon as I upload the Neo drawing, maybe you can go through that and think to yourself, oh, that's how he did that. But yeah, if you guys actually apply this to any of your drawings or it's helpful in any way, then please let me know. I think that that would be awesome. And if you're actually interested in seeing a final version of this drawing or just supporting the channel in general, I also have a Patreon. So I'll just go ahead and link that in the description or around here somewhere. But yeah, if this video was helpful, awesome. Let me know that it was, and I will see you guys later. Bye!